For weeks, Buckingham Palace had been trying to project an image of calm. Carefully choreographed appearances, controlled press briefings, measured smiles during public engagements, every detail had been arranged with almost surgical precision to convince the world that the monarchy remained stable despite the growing shadows surrounding King Charles's reign. But according to whispers now spreading through royal media circles, that illusion may have shattered behind closed palace doors during a private internal discussion so tense that even senior aides were reportedly left stunned by the king's reaction. It allegedly began with a single briefing document, one ordinary-looking page buried deep within a stack of palace communications prepared ahead of Meghan Markle's newest public initiative. At first, aides believed it would be another manageable Sussex media cycle, another temporary storm the institution could quietly outlast through silence and distance. But insiders now claim something inside that briefing struck an unexpectedly raw nerve with the king himself. Sources familiar with the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace describe an unsettling shift in tone the moment Charles reviewed the material. The language surrounding Meghan's latest move, described publicly as modern, empowering, and commercially ambitious, allegedly triggered fears inside the monarchy that the line separating royal identity from celebrity branding was beginning to collapse entirely. And according to multiple royal commentators quietly speaking behind the scenes, the king's response was not irritation. It was alarm. Deep, personal, institutional alarm. Because beneath the polished headlines and glamorous media rollout, palace insiders allegedly saw something far more dangerous unfolding. They saw the continued transformation of royal mystique into commercial spectacle. They saw a monarchy already weakened by scandal, illness, generational division, and public skepticism being pulled once again into a narrative it could no longer fully control. And for a king already carrying the physical exhaustion of cancer treatment while trying desperately to stabilize the institution inherited after Queen Elizabeth's death, that realization reportedly landed with devastating emotional force. According to individuals familiar with palace administrative discussions, Charles had spent much of early 2026 attempting to avoid exactly this kind of escalation. His reign, insiders whisper, was never supposed to become defined by warfare with his own son and daughter-in-law. Behind the scenes, the palace had allegedly hoped time itself might slowly cool tensions between the Sussexes and the crown. Instead, every few months seemed to bring another carefully timed controversy, another media explosion, another emotional reopening of wounds the monarchy could barely contain in public. Yet this latest situation reportedly felt different to those inside the palace because it touched something even more sensitive than reputation. It touched legitimacy. Royal advisors have long feared that modern celebrity culture and monarchy operate according to completely opposite rules. Celebrity thrives on exposure, reinvention, emotional disclosure, and constant visibility. Monarchy survives through restraint, distance, symbolism, and the illusion of permanence. Once those worlds begin overlapping too aggressively, insiders claim the institution itself risks appearing diminished, transactional, even performative. And according to palace whispers now circulating among royal correspondents, Meghan's newest venture allegedly pushed dangerously close to that boundary in ways that deeply unsettled senior members of the royal household. Reports suggest Charles did not initially raise his voice. In fact, what disturbed aides most was reportedly the opposite. Witnesses allegedly described the king becoming unusually quiet during internal conversations surrounding the matter. Those who have worked within palace culture for decades understand that silence from the monarch can often signal far greater concern than anger itself. One palace insider reportedly claimed the atmosphere inside the room became icy as discussions continued behind closed doors, with several senior advisors warning that the monarchy could not afford another prolonged Sussex-driven media war while Charles remained physically vulnerable and public confidence in the institution was already under pressure. But the real shock came afterward. According to various royal commentators, subtle signals soon began leaking from Buckingham Palace suggesting the king had privately objected far more strongly than anyone expected. To outsiders, the changes may have appeared almost invisible. Slightly colder language during background press briefings. Unusually rigid scheduling adjustments. Carefully measured distancing in palace messaging. Yet within the coded world of royal communication, insiders insist those signals carried explosive meaning. The monarchy almost never reveals emotional strain publicly unless something far more serious is happening beneath the surface. That is precisely why veteran royal correspondents reportedly reacted with such immediate fascination once whispers of institutional frustration and private concern began surfacing through trusted media channels. According to longtime observers of palace behavior, Buckingham Palace does not allow those kinds of phrases to circulate accidentally. Every leak, every omission, every carefully worded silence is believed to serve a purpose. And this time, many inside Britain's royal press corps allegedly interpreted the message as unmistakable. The palace wanted the world to understand that tensions had reached a level far beyond ordinary family disagreement. Some insiders even claim Charles had finally begun viewing the Sussex conflict not merely as emotional family fallout, but as a direct challenge to the monarchy's ability to preserve authority in a rapidly changing media age. That shift in perspective reportedly terrified senior palace aides because once the crown begins treating a family dispute as an institutional threat, the response itself inevitably becomes colder, more strategic, and far less forgiving. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, the global reaction exploded with astonishing speed. British tabloids, American networks, YouTube commentators, royal analysts, and social media influencers all rushed to dissect the growing speculation surrounding Charles's alleged objections. Within hours, competing narratives flooded the public conversation. Sussex supporters accused the monarchy of once again orchestrating quiet hostility toward Meghan while refusing to acknowledge the pressures she faced after leaving royal life. Royal loyalists countered that the institution had shown extraordinary patience for years and was finally reaching the limit of what it could tolerate without risking irreversible damage to the crown's public image. But behind all the noise, insiders whisper that something far more emotionally devastating was unfolding in private. According to figures close to royal administrative circles, Charles increasingly feels trapped inside an impossible role, one that forces him to choose repeatedly between the instincts of a father and the responsibilities of a sovereign. Palace aides reportedly describe a king emotionally exhausted not only by illness, but by the relentless burden of managing a monarchy caught between ancient tradition and modern celebrity warfare. Every decision now carries consequences. Too much silence risks making the institution appear weak. Too much aggression risks deepening the public fracture even further. And according to those familiar with private strategy discussions, Charles allegedly fears history may ultimately judge his reign not by diplomacy, environmental causes, or constitutional service, but by whether he succeeded or failed in protecting the monarchy from internal collapse during one of its most unstable modern eras. Yet even that may not be the palace's greatest fear anymore. Because according to whispers now intensifying behind royal walls, concern is rapidly shifting away from what Meghan and Harry have already done toward what they may still be preparing to do next. Senior aides are reportedly monitoring every public appearance, every media partnership, every subtle hint of future projects with growing anxiety. Some insiders claim the monarchy no longer views Sussex controversies as isolated events at all, but as part of an escalating cycle capable of destabilizing royal messaging whenever the institution appears most vulnerable. And with King Charles physically weakened, Prince William quietly assuming greater authority behind the scenes, and public trust already hanging in a fragile balance, palace strategists allegedly fear the next move could become the most damaging chapter yet. Because inside Buckingham Palace tonight, one terrifying question now reportedly overshadows everything else. What happens if the monarchy can no longer control the meaning of royalty itself? As panic quietly spread through palace corridors, another realization reportedly began taking hold among senior royals, one far darker than the controversy dominating global headlines. According to insiders familiar with internal strategy discussions, Buckingham Palace no longer fears Meghan Markle merely as a disruptive public figure or controversial outsider. What truly unsettles the institution now, palace whispers claim, is the possibility that Harry and Meghan may have already discovered something the monarchy spent generations trying to prevent: the ability to wield royal influence without remaining under royal control. And for an institution built almost entirely on hierarchy, discipline, symbolism, and carefully guarded mystique, that possibility allegedly represents a threat far more dangerous than any single interview, memoir, or media scandal. Behind closed doors, aides reportedly began describing the Sussex situation not as temporary turbulence, but as the beginning of a much larger transformation capable of reshaping how the monarchy itself functions in the modern world. Because according to figures close to royal administrative circles, the crown's greatest power was never political authority alone. Its real strength came from emotional ownership over royal identity itself. For centuries, the palace controlled the image, language, access, symbolism, and mythology surrounding the monarchy. The institution decided how royalty appeared to the public, how narratives were shaped, how crises were managed, and how history would eventually remember each generation. But now, insiders claim that control is slipping in ways senior royals never fully anticipated. Through documentaries, streaming platforms, interviews, global media partnerships, podcasts, personal storytelling, and modern celebrity influence, Harry and Meghan allegedly built an entirely separate royal ecosystem outside palace authority, one capable of competing directly with Buckingham Palace for public attention, emotional sympathy, and international narrative control. And according to royal commentators monitoring the situation closely, that realization has sent waves of anxiety through the highest levels of the monarchy. Because for the first time in modern royal history, the palace may no longer possess exclusive command over what royal identity means to the world. Reports suggest this fear intensified dramatically after Meghan's latest public initiative began generating massive international discussion. To ordinary audiences, it looked like another polished celebrity project carefully designed for headlines and brand expansion. But inside palace walls, according to insiders, the reaction was far colder and far more strategic. Senior advisors allegedly saw patterns that deeply disturbed them. Carefully selected imagery invoking service, compassion, dignity, empowerment, and social influence. Language subtly echoing themes traditionally associated with royal duty. Public messaging designed to maintain emotional proximity to the prestige of monarchy while operating entirely outside the restrictions and obligations of the institution itself. Royal traditionalists reportedly viewed this not simply as branding, but as symbolic encroachment into territory the crown historically considered sacred. And according to those familiar with private palace discussions, several senior figures quietly warned that if those boundaries continued eroding, the monarchy could eventually face an identity crisis unlike anything seen in generations. What made the situation even more emotionally explosive was timing. King Charles was already struggling under extraordinary pressure long before the newest Sussex controversy erupted. Since his cancer diagnosis became public, palace insiders describe an institution operating in a near-constant state of controlled anxiety. Every public appearance involving the king is reportedly planned with extreme care. Every health update is scrutinized globally within minutes. Every scheduling adjustment triggers speculation across media networks and social platforms worldwide. Behind the ceremonial calm projected outwardly, insiders claim Buckingham Palace has spent months attempting to preserve the appearance of continuity while quietly preparing for an increasingly uncertain future. And within that fragile atmosphere, Meghan's latest move allegedly struck palace strategists like another incoming storm arriving at the exact moment the monarchy appeared least capable of absorbing additional instability. According to several royal correspondents, discussions inside the palace soon shifted away from publicity management and toward something much more serious: institutional survival. Some insiders reportedly began raising fears that modern audiences, particularly younger generations, no longer distinguish clearly between monarchy as constitutional duty and monarchy as celebrity entertainment. That distinction matters enormously to royal traditionalists because once the crown becomes emotionally interchangeable with influencer culture, streaming fame, or commercial branding, the mystique protecting the institution risks collapsing altogether. And according to whispers now circulating among palace advisors, Charles has allegedly become deeply troubled by the possibility that the monarchy may already be losing that battle. Sources close to royal administrative streams suggest the king increasingly views the current crisis not through the lens of ordinary family dysfunction, but through the terrifying possibility that the institution inherited from Queen Elizabeth may not survive the digital age in recognizable form. That fear, insiders claim, has transformed the emotional atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace into something tense, defensive, and at times almost paranoid. Staff reportedly operate under tighter communication protocols whenever Sussex-related topics emerge publicly. Access to internal discussions has allegedly become more restricted. Media coordination strategies are reviewed repeatedly to prevent even minor palace signals from being misinterpreted during periods of heightened tension. Royal observers have noticed subtle but telling shifts as well. The palace now emphasizes continuity, service, tradition, and constitutional duty more aggressively than at any point since Charles ascended the throne. According to insiders, those repeated themes are not accidental. They are part of a broader strategy designed to reinforce the monarchy's institutional identity at a time when palace officials fear public perception itself is becoming dangerously fragmented. Yet perhaps the most emotionally devastating aspect of the entire situation lies within the growing divide between Charles and Prince Harry himself. According to palace whispers, the king still struggles privately with the unbearable contradiction at the center of this crisis. Harry remains his son. Despite years of interviews, accusations, public fallout, memoir revelations, and institutional conflict, Charles reportedly continues carrying deep emotional pain over the collapse of their relationship. Some insiders even claim the king secretly hoped reconciliation might still be possible one day. But those hopes, according to commentators familiar with recent palace tensions, have allegedly weakened dramatically in recent months. Each new Sussex project reportedly reinforces fears among senior royals that Harry no longer sees himself primarily as part of the institution, but as part of an entirely separate global narrative built around public exposure and personal storytelling. And for a monarchy shaped historically by silence, discretion, and emotional restraint, that transformation feels almost impossible to absorb. Meanwhile, Prince William's position inside the unfolding conflict has reportedly hardened further behind closed doors. Unlike Charles, whose decisions remain burdened by paternal emotion, insiders increasingly describe William as viewing the Sussex crisis through a far colder institutional lens. According to figures familiar with palace dynamics, the Prince of Wales allegedly believes the monarchy has already spent too many years reacting defensively to controversy instead of reinforcing boundaries more decisively. That perspective reportedly gained enormous influence after the latest palace tensions emerged. Senior royal advisors are said to view William as the figure most prepared to protect the crown through stricter controls, tighter institutional discipline, and a more uncompromising separation between working royals and the Sussex media machine. Some commentators have even suggested the future king already operates mentally as though the next era of monarchy has begun. And according to palace insiders, that future may look dramatically different from the emotionally flexible approach Charles initially hoped to maintain. Reports now suggest discussions surrounding the monarchy's long-term survival have quietly accelerated behind palace walls. Royal historians increasingly compare the current atmosphere to earlier constitutional crises that forced the crown to redefine itself in moments of existential danger. The abdication crisis surrounding Edward VIII. The public fury after Princess Diana's death. The collapse of Prince Andrew's public standing. Each scandal tested whether the institution could adapt without permanently losing legitimacy. But according to several royal commentators, the Sussex conflict feels uniquely dangerous because it unfolds inside a media environment far more ruthless, globalized, emotional, and uncontrollable than anything previous monarchs ever faced. Every gesture becomes content. Every silence becomes speculation. Every family fracture becomes international entertainment within minutes. And palace insiders allegedly fear the monarchy was never designed to survive under that level of relentless exposure. Yet despite all the strategic planning, emotional strain, and institutional maneuvering now unfolding behind closed doors, one chilling reality reportedly continues haunting senior figures inside Buckingham Palace above all else. The palace may no longer be fighting merely to control a controversy. According to whispers growing louder among royal insiders tonight, the monarchy may now be fighting to preserve the very illusion of permanence that has protected the crown for centuries. By the time senior palace officials realized how rapidly the crisis was escalating, insiders claimed the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace had already shifted from concern to full-scale containment mode. What began publicly as another wave of royal speculation was now allegedly being treated behind closed doors as something far more volatile, a direct collision between two completely different visions of power, influence, and public loyalty. According to figures familiar with internal royal discussions, aides close to King Charles feared the monarchy was entering a dangerous new phase where traditional palace strategies no longer guaranteed control over public perception. For generations, Buckingham Palace survived scandals through silence, patience, and carefully measured distance. The institution believed controversy eventually faded if the crown refused to descend into emotional warfare. But insiders now whisper that the Sussex era shattered those assumptions entirely. In the age of streaming platforms, viral media cycles, algorithm-driven outrage, and constant digital storytelling, silence no longer creates mystery. It creates a vacuum. And according to palace strategists increasingly alarmed by the changing media landscape, Harry and Meghan understand that reality far better than the institution they left behind. Reports suggest this growing fear became painfully obvious during emergency discussions held shortly after Meghan's latest initiative exploded across global headlines. Royal commentators claim senior advisors monitoring public reaction noticed something deeply unsettling almost immediately. The monarchy was no longer controlling the emotional center of the story. Instead of public attention focusing on constitutional duty, royal stability, or Charles's efforts to preserve continuity during illness, the narrative once again revolved around conflict, emotional grievance, personal storytelling, and celebrity-driven visibility. And according to insiders, that shift reportedly triggered alarm throughout palace communication teams because it reinforced a fear many senior royals had been quietly carrying for years. Modern audiences are increasingly drawn toward emotional authenticity rather than institutional restraint. That trend, palace traditionalists believe, threatens the monarchy at its very foundation. Because the crown depends on emotional distance to preserve mystique. Once royalty becomes emotionally accessible in the same way celebrities are accessible, the institution risks appearing ordinary, reactive, even fragile. And according to figures close to palace administrative circles, Meghan's growing influence within global media culture allegedly symbolizes that danger more than anything else. She represents a form of modern visibility the monarchy cannot fully compete with and cannot completely silence either. Insiders claim this realization has become especially painful for King Charles personally because his reign was already facing enormous structural challenges long before the Sussex conflict intensified again. Unlike Queen Elizabeth, who ruled during decades when monarchy still occupied a largely protected cultural position, Charles inherited the throne during a period of accelerating instability. Public trust in institutions has weakened globally. Younger generations increasingly question inherited power structures. Celebrity culture dominates attention spans. Social media rewards emotional conflict over dignified restraint. And according to royal historians now analyzing the situation closely, Charles may be the first modern monarch forced to defend the crown during an era where monarchy itself risks becoming culturally outdated in the eyes of large segments of the public. Palace insiders allegedly say that pressure has transformed the emotional atmosphere surrounding the king into something deeply exhausting. Behind the public smiles and ceremonial appearances stands a monarch privately battling illness while simultaneously carrying the burden of protecting a centuries-old institution during one of its most unpredictable modern transitions. Reports suggest Charles has grown increasingly aware that every Sussex controversy drains attention away from the causes, reforms, and legacy he hoped would define his reign. Instead of being remembered primarily for modernization efforts, environmental advocacy, or constitutional stability, insiders whisper that Charles fears history may ultimately remember his era as the period when the monarchy lost control of its own narrative. And according to some palace figures, that possibility has become emotionally devastating for the king. Yet while Charles reportedly wrestles with emotional conflict and institutional anxiety, Prince William's rise behind the scenes has allegedly accelerated at remarkable speed. Sources familiar with palace dynamics describe the Prince of Wales as increasingly dominant during internal strategy discussions, particularly whenever Sussex-related tensions emerge publicly. Unlike his father, William is reportedly viewed by many senior aides as less emotionally conflicted and far more focused on long-term institutional survival. According to royal commentators, the future king allegedly believes the monarchy made a critical mistake by allowing ambiguity to exist for too long regarding Harry and Meghan's relationship with the crown. In William's reported view, unclear boundaries created space for endless cycles of controversy, emotional leverage, and public confusion over what role the Sussexes still occupy within royal life. That perspective, insiders claim, has now hardened into something far more uncompromising. Several palace observers have even described William as quietly preparing for a future monarchy built around strict separation, tighter discipline, reduced emotional flexibility, and a much smaller inner circle of trusted working royals. Behind palace walls, whispers continue spreading about what some insiders call the containment era, an emerging strategy focused not on reconciliation, but on minimizing institutional vulnerability moving forward. According to various interpretations circulating through royal circles, the monarchy's internal philosophy may now be shifting permanently away from hopes of family healing and toward pure preservation of the crown itself. And within that evolving structure, Catherine, Princess of Wales, reportedly plays an increasingly critical symbolic role. Palace loyalists allegedly view Catherine as the perfect counterweight to the turbulence surrounding Meghan's global media image. Where Meghan is associated with reinvention, visibility, emotional openness, and celebrity culture, Catherine is carefully positioned as calm, disciplined, discreet, and institutionally loyal. Insiders claim palace communications teams are acutely aware of that contrast and have quietly reinforced it through imagery, messaging, and public presentation over recent years. Because according to senior royal strategists, the monarchy's survival may depend heavily on preserving at least one branch of the royal family still capable of embodying traditional ideas of stability and restraint. Meanwhile, outside palace walls, the public divide surrounding Harry and Meghan continues deepening with astonishing intensity. Social media platforms have transformed the royal conflict into a kind of ideological battlefield where millions of people now project larger cultural anxieties onto the House of Windsor itself. To Sussex supporters, Harry and Meghan symbolize liberation from outdated institutional control, emotional honesty, racial awareness, and resistance against rigid royal structures. To royal traditionalists, however, the Sussex brand represents the dangerous collapse of duty into personal ambition, celebrity influence overpowering constitutional dignity, and private grievance threatening national symbolism. According to media analysts studying the phenomenon closely, the emotional polarization surrounding the royal family has now reached levels almost unprecedented in modern monarchy history. And palace insiders reportedly fear that every new controversy only deepens those divisions further, making reconciliation increasingly impossible both privately and publicly. But perhaps the darkest realization unfolding behind palace walls is this: the monarchy may no longer possess a clear path toward resolution at all. Every possible response now carries enormous risk. Public confrontation could intensify sympathy for Harry and Meghan internationally. Continued silence could reinforce perceptions of weakness and institutional paralysis. Reconciliation efforts could reopen fresh controversy. Permanent separation could cement the image of a fractured royal family for an entire generation. According to figures close to royal administrative discussions, this impossible strategic deadlock has created profound anxiety among senior advisors surrounding the king. Some insiders even whisper that Buckingham Palace increasingly operates under the belief that the Sussex conflict is no longer fully manageable in the traditional sense. Instead, the institution's goal may simply be to survive each new media wave without suffering irreversible damage to public legitimacy. And as Charles grows physically weaker while William's influence expands steadily behind the scenes, one chilling question reportedly continues haunting the highest levels of the monarchy tonight. What happens if the next chapter of this royal war becomes even bigger than everything that came before it? Inside Buckingham Palace, according to insiders, the final stage of this unfolding crisis was no longer being discussed as a temporary controversy or even a manageable public relations challenge. It was being treated, quietly and with increasing seriousness, as a defining stress test for the survival of modern monarchy itself. What makes this moment so unusual, royal commentators claim, is not just the presence of conflict between the Sussexes and the institution, but the scale at which every decision now carries consequences far beyond palace walls. Every internal discussion allegedly returns to the same unresolved tension: how to protect a centuries-old system in an era where narrative moves faster than control, and where perception often outweighs tradition. Within that environment, King Charles is reportedly viewed by close aides as a monarch carrying an almost impossible emotional burden. On one side stands the role of sovereign, responsible for preserving continuity, stability, and public trust in the crown. On the other stands a father still bound by emotional ties to a son who has become one of the most discussed figures in global media. According to palace whispers, this duality has become increasingly difficult to reconcile, especially as each new Sussex-related development appears to reopen old wounds that never fully healed in the first place. Insiders claim Charles is deeply aware that any visible reaction risks being interpreted as institutional hostility, while silence risks being interpreted as weakness or avoidance. That delicate balance, once manageable through traditional royal communication strategies, now reportedly feels far more fragile in a digital world where interpretation spreads instantly and uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Prince William's presence within internal palace strategy has allegedly grown significantly more influential. Sources familiar with royal discussions describe a gradual but noticeable shift in tone, from cautious containment toward firmer structural boundaries. Unlike his father, William is increasingly portrayed by insiders as operating from a long-term institutional preservation mindset, one that prioritizes clarity over ambiguity and stability over emotional flexibility. According to royal commentators, this approach reflects a belief that the monarchy cannot continue functioning effectively if its external boundaries remain open to reinterpretation through media cycles and personal branding narratives. As a result, some palace observers claim the future direction of the crown is quietly being shaped around a more defined separation between working royals and those operating entirely outside institutional responsibility. Within that evolving structure, Catherine, Princess of Wales, is reportedly seen as a central stabilizing figure whose public role has become increasingly important during periods of uncertainty. Palace insiders allegedly describe her presence as symbolically essential to maintaining continuity, especially when the institution is under intense global scrutiny. In contrast to the volatility surrounding Sussex-related media cycles, her carefully maintained public image is often interpreted within royal circles as a representation of predictability and controlled visibility, qualities the monarchy now considers strategically valuable. Yet despite these internal efforts at stabilization, external pressures continue to intensify. The global media environment surrounding the royal family has become more relentless, more interpretive, and more emotionally charged than at any previous point in modern history. According to analysts close to royal reporting circles, the monarchy is no longer simply responding to events, it is reacting to interpretations of events that multiply across platforms within minutes. This has created what some insiders allegedly describe as a permanent state of narrative instability, where controlling the message has become almost as challenging as managing the events themselves. In this environment, Meghan Markle's continued presence in global media discourse is viewed by palace strategists as both unavoidable and highly influential, not necessarily because of any single action, but because of the sustained attention her public identity continues to generate across international audiences. According to royal commentators, this sustained visibility complicates the monarchy's traditional communication model, which depends heavily on restraint, limited commentary, and controlled exposure. Every high-profile Sussex appearance or project reportedly forces Buckingham Palace back into a defensive posture, even when no official response is issued. That reactive cycle, insiders claim, is precisely what concerns senior advisors the most, because it prevents the institution from fully controlling its own narrative rhythm. At the same time, King Charles is reportedly said to be increasingly focused on preserving institutional stability during a period marked by both personal and constitutional pressure. His ongoing health concerns, combined with the demands of modern monarchy, have allegedly contributed to a working environment where every decision carries heightened emotional and symbolic weight. According to those familiar with internal dynamics, Charles remains committed to maintaining dignity and continuity above all else, even as external pressures continue to test the limits of that commitment. But behind this commitment lies a quieter and more troubling concern among palace insiders. The fear that the monarchy may be entering a phase where traditional methods of crisis management are no longer sufficient to contain modern media-driven escalation. What once would have been managed through discretion and time now unfolds in public view almost instantly, leaving little room for controlled resolution. And as each new Sussex-related development emerges, the institution reportedly finds itself forced once again into a familiar and increasingly exhausting pattern of reaction, interpretation, and damage control. According to royal observers, this cycle has created a deep sense of fatigue within senior palace circles. Not necessarily panic, but something more subtle and arguably more dangerous in the long term: institutional exhaustion. A feeling that every attempt to restore calm is followed by another unexpected disruption, preventing any sustained period of narrative stability. Within that context, even silence has become politically charged. interpreted differently depending on perspective, and often amplified rather than resolved. And as Buckingham Palace continues navigating this delicate balance, insiders claim a growing awareness is taking hold that the current situation is no longer just about one family dispute or even a series of media controversies. It is about whether the monarchy itself can continue operating under conditions where emotional narratives, global celebrity influence, and institutional tradition are permanently entangled. This realization, according to those close to royal discussions, has made the present moment feel historically significant in a way few inside the institution are willing to openly acknowledge. Because beneath all the controlled messaging and carefully managed appearances, one unsettling truth appears to be emerging within palace walls. The monarchy is no longer simply responding to crisis. It is adapting, under pressure, to a new reality it did not design and cannot fully control.